1, 2, 3.
Welcome to Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin. Scéalta is a joint production between Fáilte Fears to Hear and Féile an Phobal. And my guest tonight is Eoghan Cadwallader. And Eoghan Cadwallader is one of those people who is everywhere, who we see all the time at demonstrations, at meetings, at public events. And you would be forgiven for believing that Eoghan Cadwallader grew here, but she didn't. So my earliest recollection of you was, I think, around about 1980, 1981. I don't know why you just arrived in Ireland at that stage, but you were here, and although you were described as a journalist, it was very clear that you weren't part of the herd. So tell me a wee bit about what life was like before you arrived.
Well, I had a very unusual and interesting childhood in that my father worked for an international company and we moved every 3 years wherever he was posted. So I lived in Indonesia, in Hamburg, in The Hague, in Oslo, and I also spent a year in Paris and a shorter times than that in Rome and Athens. And I went to school in England, I went to school in Hertfordshire and in Suffolk. And then I went to Exeter University, and then I went to London University. I got a scholarship to study journalism, and then I started training in Bradford in West Yorkshire. And it was during my time in Bradford that the hunger strikes were taking place, the second hunger strikes, biggest story in the world. And me, as an ambitious young journalist, I decided to spend my 2 weeks annual leave in Ireland. So I knew someone in Belfast and someone in Dublin. So across I came, and as luck would have it, it was at the zenith of the tension. Bobby Sands was lying dying in the maze. And my experience in Belfast was entirely not what I expected. There were, as you know, Joe, yourself, there were protests every day involving men, women, and children. There was a high intensity of stress and tension, everyone listening to the news every half hour, and there was people were watching out for strange cars in the area. People were stockpiling flour and bandages, and when Bobby Sands died, I was actually in Dublin, and I went to O'Connell Bridge to observe the protests there, and the whole experience was so completely overwhelming to me as an English person, not knowing very, very little about Irish history or politics. And I went home to Bradford with my head full of wonder and horror and shock, just determined to come back here and work here if I could. And I did. I got a job with the BBC in 1981.
But you weren't absolutely unprepared for politics. You may have not been familiar with Irish politics, but as a student, you had been active in the Student Union, and you were active in the Labour Party. I think you stood as a candidate at one stage.
Yeah, I did. I was very active in the Student Union. I was editor of the student paper. I was vice president of the Student Union. I was a student senator, and I worked 3 days a week because I had no money. So I worked 3 days a week. One of those days was in the Labour Club in town. I'd always been interested in Labour politics. I was a trade unionist when I worked for a bookshop in London before I even went to university. And I stood for election for the Labour Party in Exeter, yes. And I subsequently became a member in Hampstead in London when I was studying at London University. And when I was in Bradford as a trainee journalist, I also was a member of the Labour Party there. So when I came to Ireland, of course, my membership lapsed.
Was it difficult? And I know that you've always had that drive to find the bit of a story that wasn't being covered, or to get behind the official announcement of events. But your friend, you're coming to Ireland at a time when there is complete chaos and turmoil, and you make the point about hunger strikers dying and people dying as a result of plastic bullets and gun battles and all of that. The people, your friends, when you told them you were going to come to Ireland and you might stay, did they think you had had a breakdown of some sort?
Well, I think the people I knew in Bradford, where I was working at the time, understood that I wanted to cover a big story. the people that were really shocked and horrified were my family. I think my father, who was an officer in the British Army during the Second World War and subsequently remained on in the army afterwards, I think he knew me well. Looking back on it now, I realize that he knew me better than I knew at the time. And he feared that if I came to Ireland, I would stay here, that I would just be enchanted by it and bewitched and just immerse myself in it. And that's exactly what happened. He was right. He certainly didn't want me to come. He tried every trick in the book to get me to leave Ireland. We even bought a house together in England, a lovely house that actually is still in the family, with the aim, I think, of enticing me back to live in England again. But, and on many occasions I've thought about that, because the life here has been difficult at times.
Yeah.
But I've never gone back, and I don't think I ever would at this stage. I think people ask me where I'm from, and I say, well, I was born in London, but it's the short answer. But I've lived in Ireland longer than I've lived anywhere else, far longer. And I've lived in Belfast longer than I was in Dublin for 7 years, but I've lived in Belfast longer than I've lived anywhere else.
You arrived in Belfast. You're obviously relatively young. What was your first job in terms of the media? What can you recall?
I was lucky enough to land a job with the BBC in Belfast. To start off with, they didn't let me cover any story relating to the conflict, because probably very wisely, because I really didn't know what I was talking about. I was just learning, and I covered all sorts of really boring stuff. I remember once I did about a final of a Scrabble competition out in County Antrim somewhere. I did all sorts of stories, anything not related to the conflict. But after a while, they began to trust me, and then for I don't know if it was 1 year or two, anyhow, I was what they call the fireman, the overnight. If anything happened overnight and the department needed somebody to go out and investigate, I was that person. So strangely enough, where I'm sitting and talking to you from now, this is in Eoghan in Armagh, the new Irish Language Cultural Centre here in Armagh, which is where I'm working from at the moment. This used to be the old fire station, and one of the jobs I was sent to in the middle of the night was a shooting of a British soldier just exactly at this spot. Other events I was sent to in the middle of the night were also in Armagh, actually, the shooting dead of a councillor, a unionist councillor, in the car park at Armagh Council. And I was first on the scene at the Darkley Mission Hall murders, and well, I won't go into a long list, but take it from me, I saw a lot of dreadful and felt and heard a lot of dreadful things during those years working for the BBC in the 1980s.
And parallel to that sort of work, and you know, I'm going to leave some places out, or some employers out by virtue of old-fashioned memory. So you were with RTE, you were with the BBC, you were with Reuters for a period. I think you were with the Irish Press.
Yeah, I was Northern editor of the Irish Press. Yeah, that was a great job.
Well,
but the Irish Press went wallop, as you know, and I lost my job then. And my husband lost his job on the same day. It was pretty disastrous. That was in the mid-1990s. One of the most satisfying, I mean, I covered the conflict and the New Ireland Forum in Dublin and abortion referenda and the heaves against Charlie Hockey, and I did a lot of work in the South as well. But one of the most satisfying jobs that I ever did was working for the newly created Ireland on Sunday, which was a newspaper that was owned by people in the South, but they decided to have a Northern edition. It was brand new, startup, and I was appointed the Northern editor. And for 4 years, I worked there as a startup project. And I also worked at the same time for Independent Network News, which was the news agency that supplied radio news to all 32 independent radio stations in the Republic of Ireland. So I was doing wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, 30-second news reports. And then at the end of the week, I was doing much longer, more discursive features and analysis for Ireland on Sunday. And while I was working for the Irish Press, I had a column in the Sunday Press as well, which was a wonderful experience too. But I mean, I was very lucky. I did all sorts of news reporting, radio, television, and newspapers, and I got a chance to express myself and my own thoughts in columns and articles and analysis, and also to be there when big things were happening, like the Good Friday Agreement. And I always liked to be on the ground when there was rioting or protests, and because I regarded some of it a bit like kind of street theatre, really, the Drum Cree protests and all of that. Fascinating to see, to experience, and to be able to express that in writing or voice reports to a larger audience.
One of the things that made you stand out from the herd was the accuracy of your reporting, but also it wasn't the NIO copy that you regurgitated and sent out. You had made friends in nearly all of the areas that you went into, that you came into contact with. So you had, on one hand, you had the community's version of events, and then you had an editor who edited the material
Yes.
that you supplied. I mean, was that a difficult balancing act?
Well, sometimes I didn't always follow the line. I remember one very instructive experience for me was on my first overnight on the BBC overnight desk, when there was always one person. It was a 24-hour newsroom in those days, and there was one person who always had to stay overnight on their own in the newsroom in the BBC to be there in case anything big happened overnight, and then to help write the morning bulletins for radio and television. And I was on the news desk, my first overnight ever on the news desk. The news came through from the RUC press office that there had been 3 men shot dead in Craigavon. And I duly reported the news that I was given by the RUC press office, that the men were in a car that had broken through a roadblock, and the RUC had taken defensive action and opened fire and shot the 3 men dead. Of course, I subsequently discovered that there was no roadblock, and it was an ambush, and the 3 men were in a car and had been set up and executed. So that was a pretty horrific experience, to find that the police were capable of telling, shall we say, not the entire verite, coming from England, believing that the forces of law and order are on the side of the citizen and don't tell lies or execute people without warning. That was a pretty shocking experience, one of many, and caused me to rethink my assumptions about British law and order and justice.
That must have put you almost separate from for many of the journalists who done exactly as you say. They got a copy from the NIO, the RUC, or the British Army, or whoever, and that became the story.
Well, I did report.
Been pushed aside.
Well, I did report an untruth, as any journalist in my position would have done, because if you're there overnight and you've got no alternative source of news, I must say that the Irish Times, Andy Pollock, who was working then for the Irish Times, he went out to the area, to the place where the shooting had taken place, and he interviewed people there, and the story that he came back with was different. And that was the first indication to me that I had reported an untruth. And it taught me that, well, news won't wait. I mean, the 3 men were dead. We had to report on that for the morning bulletins. You couldn't just ignore it until you'd established what the truth was. And I don't think the full truth of what happened that night has yet been established. And it's 35 plus years later. So if you're a journalist and you're on your own and you've only got one source of information, and that source of information is the police, then you really have not got much alternative but to report what you were told, so long as you say according to the RUC. But it taught me a lot. It taught me something about journalism and about the police and about Northern Ireland. And I was always after that very skeptical and always tried to find out what had actually happened by getting as close to the source of the news as possible.
One of the outstanding pieces of work that developed out of the hunger strike was the David Beresford book, 10 Men Dead. And I know you were close to him, and I know that a lot of the stuff he kind of would have discussed with a very small group of people who had, as you say, who had a view of the reality and then a view of the story, and they're not always the same thing. That's the point you're making. But was it a case that you slowly moved away from writing what you're told or writing what is acceptable to be, because you did develop a reputation of somebody that wasn't part of that herd?
Well, at the time when David was writing 10 Men Dead, he wrote some of it in the apartment in the flat that I was living in. I had one of the best apartments in Belfast before I lived in it. Anne McCarty, the Guardian correspondent, lived in it, and she and Lord Longford wrote a book about Ireland. And then David lived in it for a while, and then I inherited it from David, and then other people moved in afterwards and wrote books as well. It was a lovely apartment on the top floor of an attic of the top floor of a huge big house off the Malone Road, where you could hear bombs and shooting going off all over Belfast, surrounded on four sides by greenery and trees. And it was a lovely apartment, huge as well. And David wrote a lot of 10 Men Dead in that place, because there was a spare room, a big spare room, and it was private, and people would come morning, noon and night to see him, and I would discreetly avoid meeting them if I could. People just came and went, and David was working in that room on his own. And on many occasions, of course, David nearly stopped writing, because he was, it was a very difficult book to write. Yeah. And there were various challenges and hurdles that he had to overcome. But in the end, of course, he did write it. And then, as you probably know, Joe, when he went back to live in South Africa, he got Parkinson's and very sadly passed far too young. Yeah. But he's left that book for us all. But yes, I suppose I got more and more curious, and things weren't quite what they seemed. And I didn't feel, and I still don't feel, that particularly the British press reflected what was truly going on here during the conflict. And I think if they had done, I think the conflict might have ended a lot faster and quicker than it did. I mean, I'm English, and I came over here and I was fascinated by what was happening. It was just overwhelming experience to be here, and totally not what I'd expected. And I don't think that I'm particularly unusual. I think that the British press has done not done a very good job in interesting, explaining, analyzing, and making what happened here into something that ordinary people in Britain would find interesting and engaging. I found it like that. And I don't think I'm that unusual. I think other people in Britain would also find it equally interesting and engaging if the story had been told in the right way. I mean, after I left Ireland, the first time I came over in 1981, when I went back, I did a series of talks all around Yorkshire, to Labour Party groups all around Yorkshire about Ireland, and people were really interested. Once you broke through the barrier that people said, oh, Northern Ireland, oh, it's terribly boring. But once you could just sort of say, hang on a sec, let's have a think about this. Is it really why do you think it's boring? And this is what it's really like. And maybe, people were interested. You could get through to them. But there was this initial barrier. And I have to say, that barrier is still very much there. Because the book I wrote 7 years ago now, Lethal Allies, when the publishing company hired a PR company in Britain to promote the book in England, and the woman who was in charge of the account read the book and talked to me, and she said she found it absolutely fascinating and shocking and horrifying when she wrote to every single contact that she had in newspapers, magazines, radio, television, everywhere. And of all the people she contacted in her book, in her address book, and of course she would have had hundreds, not one person phoned her back to ask for further information about the book. And she found that really shocking. And I find that profoundly depressing, that something that is so interesting and so important for both Ireland and Britain is just something that's ordinary people in England have not an idea about. I'm talking about collusion now, of course.
Of course. Just before we come to that, because I want to go back on to the whole Glenanne gang and the cover-up and all of that. And I know working with the families was very difficult for you and very stressful, and all of that sorrow and the roadblocks that people had to get through to get the truth and all that. But we'll leave that just for a second. Holy Cross was another high point, both in your personal life and also what I mean by that stress and being there.
Well, I blame Martina Purdy for that. Martina Purdy used to be Northern Ireland political correspondent, now then went to become a sister, a religious sister. Martina dared me. Martina was writing a book at the time about Stormont, and she had the publisher on her back demanding that she produce the work by deadlines. And I think she said to me, why don't you write a book about Holy Cross? Because I'd been going up there every single day during the protest, and it had affected me very much. And so I said, okay, I will. And then I did write a book about Holy Cross. I always had a soft spot for Ardoyne, I have to say. Ardoyne seemed to me to be a place apart where it was like an open prison in those days, only one way in and one way out, no jobs, plenty of bookie shops and clubs, but no jobs, and people living in very small houses and a very tight-knit community. And I always had a soft spot for the place. And then when I went up there and observed what was going on, I was involved over the summer and then went up at the start of the new term when the Loyalist protests really got underway. I mean, like a lot of other journalists, I found it really, really shocking to the core what was going on there. I felt ashamed to be witnessing it. I felt almost voyeuristic, standing there, not being able to do anything and watching what was going on. It was, I mean, I think all the journalists that I've spoken to who were there for Holy Cross all feel the same, that it was a thoroughly unedifying spectacle, didn't reflect very well on society in general, and almost feel ashamed of having witnessed it. But I did write a book about Holy Cross, and it was hard work, but it was really worthwhile, and we had a great launch, and I still have friends and family in Ardoyne, and I really enjoyed writing it in a way, but it was a labor of love, but it was also very hard. It wasn't a very pleasant subject to reflect on, but it was very important, because at this remove, I have to say that if the peace process required, I mean, a lot of people think the reason that the Loyalist protest wasn't closed down much faster was that there was a fear that it might risk the peace process, that the Loyalist protest might spread and get out of hand and be completely out of control, in which case it would have threatened the peace process. But if that's what the peace process has needed, that these little girls were subjected to that horror for 6 weeks or however long it was, then you have to ask yourself, what kind of peace process is this, when children can be subjected to the abuse and the fear and the horror that they were subjected to? And at this remove, you have to ask, what kind of peace process is it that requires that as a sacrifice from small children? And it also reflected very, very badly on the lack of leadership in the Loyalist community, because surely somebody somewhere should have said, this is no good for anyone, and it should have been closed down far faster than it was. I think there are many lessons out of Holy Cross for us even to this day.
I would disagree with you very slightly, which I don't do very often. I think that a lot of journalists covered a story. I think you covered an event. Was there personal, did you feel personal pressure that to tell what was happening would perhaps stop what was happening? You know, did you feel that you had a almost a responsibility to expose what clearly was an obscene period of Belfast history?
Well, I went up there every morning and stood and watched Father Troy and Father Donegan as they took the kids up the road to the school, and then I went back in the evening and I reported on it. I wanted to be there because after 9/11, which happened at the start of the Holy Cross protests, a lot of the international press left, and I felt it was important that there should be somebody there in case anything really bad happened, that there should be somebody there. And I also had a fellow feeling, you know, I got to know some of the parents and everything, and I felt that by going there I was showing, well, not showing solidarity, but making witness to what was happening. But there was a lot of pressure on you at the time to write both sides of the story, kind of thing. And looking back on it now, there weren't two sides to that story, any more than there's two sides to a story about child abuse by priests or whatever. There is only one side. And there was also a lot of pressure on the families to take what was called the alternative route. And I mean, when looking back on it now, no matter what, I mean, the issue of Holy Cross was whether these children had a right to go to school in peace, and anything else was really out of order. You can look at the, you know, that the Loyalists claim they were provoked, but no amount of provocation, even had it existed, would have justified what they did.
I suppose the next question is one that would be asked of anyone in that predicament. Did you see yourself, or was there a beginning of a process where journalism was becoming more difficult, where your voice was becoming more outside of what the journalistic herd were saying?
Well, I can remember I've always kind of got it in the neck from other journalists, but that comes with the territory. I'm not complaining about that. I can remember when I was when I did what I could to highlight the case of the Birmingham Six, and I was criticised for that. And I always had an interest in miscarriage of justice cases. I visited prisoners in jail, Christy Walsh, and other people who were in jail who I believed were not guilty, had been sent to jail wrongly. I had a big problem with the diplomat courts, that people were just getting sent to jail on very slim evidence. And one of the duties of a free press is to cover the courts properly, and newspapers and TV and broadcasters at the time, I don't think, did do that. Rather than, to save money, basically, they relied on agency copy from the courts, rather than send a journalist to watch day after day after day what was going on in the courts. There was a feeling that, oh, the courts can be covered, we can just have an agency cover the courts, not send our own people down there to find out what was really going on. And I think a lot of things happened in Crumlin Road that shouldn't have done, and that journalists weren't there, and there was no kind of feeling of passion or commitment to properly covering what was going on in the courts. And people would, well, they called it at the time the conveyor belt. The people were just sent to jail, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. But there was nobody really there to critique the judges and the lawyers. And that the press as a whole really abrogated its responsibility during those days by not sufficiently covering the courts. I always found court work very interesting, and I enjoyed it. But it was a thankless task, because not very many other people felt the way I did. So I was a lone voice in crying in the wilderness on many occasions.
I want to move on to the second book, Lethal Allies. But before I do, can I just say that I would commend the Holy Cross book even now, to anyone who has an interest in studying journalism or historically looking at events that had a profound effect. The Holy Cross, you're right, of course, that part of the reason the Holy Cross issue and the behaviour of some sections of loyalists wasn't closed down was because of the fear of upsetting them or push them in a direction. But the book, as an example of an event, is something I think people should read. It's an amazing book, even for us who lived through that period. It brings back, and I read it again the other night because I knew this interview we were planning it. It refreshes the memory, I have to say. So,
I'm glad to say, Joe, that I was interviewed just a few days ago by RTE, who are going to be running a half-hour program towards the end of September in the Tuesday at 7:30 slot on RTE in the Irish language about Holy Cross. It's the 20th anniversary next year, so there will be other chances to reflect on that whole episode and what lessons it has for us now.
It was an amazing, well, it was a horrible period, but it was amazing. So the second book, the Glenanne gang and all the implications of them, how did that come about?
Well, I decided, you were asking me about journalism changing and the story changing. Yes, journalism has changed and the story has changed. I found myself doing 24-hour rolling news for independent network news in the Republic, and I was up at Stormont and covering committee meetings and stuff like that. So the story had changed from being a story about violence and death and bombings and shootings. It became about identity and commitment, and when is violence justified and when is it not justified, all those big issues, and about the rise of Sinn Féin electorally and all of that. That was just a hugely exciting period of life here to be covering as a journalist. It became a bit more, well, I mean, the whole talks leading up to the Good Friday Agreement were a nightmare. But anyhow, then it just became, not to put too mild a word, it became a bit more boring, to be honest with you. And also journalism had changed and the story had changed. And also because of changes in my own life, my husband became quite ill. I decided that I didn't want to continue working as a journalist. And my interests had always been human rights, victims, what had gone on, the truth, all of those issues. And the Pat Finucane Centre was covering those issues and working with people. And they advertised a job that was a 3-day-a-week job. And I thought, this is, that's a round hole and I'm a round peg to go in it. So I applied and got the job 10 years ago now. And I thought it would also lift some of the stress on me of working as a journalist, because journalism is an immensely stressful job, at least it was in those days. So I thought 3 days a week working in human rights, telling people's stories, and completely different. But the first thing they asked me to do, the first thing, literally before I even started my first day, was to write another book. And my heart sank to the floor. The last thing I wanted to do was write another book. Holy Cross had been a labor, it tested me. I thought it had tested me to the edge of my abilities. But then when they asked me to write a book about Glenanne, and I was horrified. And then I started reading the files. And the more I read, the more horrified I became, the more confused I became, and as I became more confused, how can anyone write a book based on this vast amount of information? Because my colleagues at the PFC had worked for 10 years on this, and they had gotten a huge amount of detail out of the Barron inquiries into Dublin Monaghan bombings in the south, out of the HET, the Historical Inquiries Team reports, out of talking to people, out of local newspaper cuttings. They'd done a vast amount of work. They amassed a huge amount of statistics and data and cross-referencing. How am I going to turn this amount of detailed information and evidence into a book that anybody would ever want to read? And the more I learned, the worse I felt, and the more impossible I thought it was. And after 4 years working with the PFC, it really nearly broke me. I sometimes say that it pushed me to the edge of madness, and then maybe a bit over the edge, to tell you the truth. But somehow or other, I drew on every reserve I had, mentally, physically, in every way possible, and managed to write it and to get it done. And I used to sit in the PFC offices in Armagh and look up at the twin spires of Armagh Cathedral and just say to myself, Anne, you've got to do this. You've got to do this. It's such an important story. It's such a unique set of circumstances that the PFC has managed to get all this data out of official documents and files. It might never happen again. This is an opportunity to tell this incredibly important, desperately sad story to a wide audience. You have to do it. And I just forced myself, and it took everything out of me. I had to work in Armagh. I couldn't work in Belfast, and I mean, so I had to travel 80 miles a day back up and from Belfast to Armagh, because all our files were here in Armagh, and I had to be able to make reference to the files. And it was a very cold winter, and I somehow managed. I mean, I found it very difficult to sleep as well, because when I got home at the end of a long day writing, I would be shaking and trembling with horror and fear, and the sheer responsibility of all these people putting their trust in us to write this book. But I did it in the end, and looking back on it, something I'm incredibly proud of doing. You know, if I hadn't had that challenge, I would never have known. But I did make it into a readable book. It sold over 20,000 copies. I've done 3 tours of the States and Australia and New Zealand, and it's been turned into a wonderful film by Sean Murray, Unquiet Graves. And it might never happen again that a group of families get as much information out of the state as we did in relation to Glenanne, and that's in no small part due to the people who worked. And I know a lot of people have got nothing but hostility towards the Historical Inquiries team, but the people we worked with in there, we couldn't get into the files. We couldn't get into Sea Park outside Carrickfergus and get all that information. There's no way that people like us would ever have been let in there. We didn't have the security vetting, but we worked with the HET, and the HET officers we worked with were very diligent, very determined, and very, very courageous. And we got a heck of a lot of information about that series of murders and the related perpetrators and ballistics and all of those things. Because if you don't have that amount of detail, then who is going to believe you? If it's just dogs in the street, rumors and speculation, it's worthless. You have to have that amount of evidence and detail so that you can cross-reference the different murders, using which guns were used in which murders and which perpetrators were linked. And without that kind of information, which you can only get out of official files, which is why it's so important that the Stormont House Agreement proposals for legacy mechanisms should not be ditched, as the British government currently wants them to do. But anyhow, we were just terribly lucky. It was a series of fortuitous circumstances that we managed to get all that information. And I was the one lucky enough, I suppose, looking back on it, to be asked to write the book. And we've done it. And the film is out, Unquiet Graves. And if I can just make a plug for that, because if anyone's not watched it, it's really worth it.
Well, I think you've been very modest, I have to say. And I think that it's more than being fortuitous that the information did exist. It always existed. It was always there. There was a lack of will to research it, to take it, collate it, to move it forward, and to do something with it. And I think that you and the Pat Finucane Centre,
well,
made that happen.
I'd say that my colleague Alan Brecknell, whose father was one of the victims, and I mean, if it hadn't been for him, then none of this information would have ever come to light. But I mean, I'd speak up for my former fellow colleagues in journalism, is that if you haven't got the facts at your disposal, if the facts are under lock and key in files that you cannot possibly get access to, then how can you really write the full or as full a truth as you want to write? If the facts are being withheld from you, deliberately withheld, locked away from the eyes of the people who were bereaved, then what can you do? You can only write a story based on the facts that you can establish and find. And if the facts are inside RUC archives, locked away where nobody can see them unless you've been security vetted to the nth degree, then you're very limited as to what you can say.
Let me make one observation, and then I want to come back on to talk about you. Many journalists that serve these communities never let the facts or lack of facts get in the way of a good story. So if the facts are being locked away and you have no access to them, that is the story, that they are being blocked, that the information that is currently held. I think you do a disservice to yourself. I think that it took tenacity, it took commitment, it took persuasion, and it took skill and courage to produce the book that eventually produced the film. So I have to say that. So I want to talk to you, just if you don't mind. The Pat Finucane Centre in itself, given the work that it does, is a new type of stress. It's a new type of difficulty because you're dealing with families who are victims, who have been denied information, who have been denied justice, and all of that. With the Glenanne families, was it hard dealing with the family? And let me tell you why I say that. I was in St. Mary's the night the book was launched, and many of the families were there, and the families were crying. That here at last, after all these years, was
Joe, I was crying.
You were crying. So do you find that stressful, or is it stressful but rewarding? Is that hard?
Well, it's a strange thing about the Glenanne families is that they've got nothing in common with each other apart from the fact that their loved ones were killed in collusion between loyalists and state forces. None of them were Republicans. They were mostly kind of upwardly mobile, aspirational, SDLP, GAA. They had no, they're not a cohesive group of people who came together and campaigned. I mean, they were all very, very ordinary people whose lives were suddenly torn apart. And we can talk about why that happened, and I've got some views on that. But they're all very, very ordinary, decent people. And a lot of them are now tending towards the Republican point of view because of their experience at the hands of the state. Whereas they might have come from a background that would be totally anti-violence, moderate, religious, community-minded people in terms of GAA and local communities who would have been artisans, plasterers, plumbers, publicans, librarians, just ordinary people. And they would have tended to be the sort of people who didn't believe that collusion existed, who would have believed that collusion was a kind of Republican propaganda. And now they know that because of what we've discovered, now they know that collusion did exist, and the state did lower itself to the law of the jungle and kill people using proxy gangs and pseudo gangs and loyalists and agents and informers and all the rest of it. It's a terribly, terribly ugly, horrible story. But the Glenanne families are very, very decent people, and they've had this awful burden inflicted on them, not only of losing their loved ones in the most appalling of circumstances, but then discovering that the people who were responsible for it were the people who were paid and had a sworn duty to protect life and uphold the law. And this puts another burden on them, that they now have to somehow or other hold their grief in and campaign and fight the state that they thought was there to protect them, that they assumed was there keeping the peace. And at that amount, that they're hugely disillusioned and hugely bitter about the fact that the people in whom they put their trust, that they thought were there to find out who was responsible for their bereavement and vindicate their rights, were the very people who were betraying them and involved in the slaughter of their relatives. I mean, you know, and it's been an immense, and I know this sounds like a usual cliche, but it really has been a huge privilege in my life to be working with those people and to help them on that long, long road towards, hopefully, truth. I don't think justice is possible at this remote distance in time from when these events took place in the early and mid 1970s. But it really has been absolutely amazing to be working with them as the truth has finally emerged in HET reports, in other reports, and in the book and the film. It's been such a wonderful journey to go with them, because after all, I mean, yes, it's an ugly story. Yes, the state sullied itself and dragged itself down to the very gutter in what it did, and is still doing that by withholding the truth from these families. But the families themselves, they remember their loved ones. The Glenanne story is a story of betrayal and hatred and sectarianism and lies. But it's also a story about the love that these families still have for their dead relatives, and the determination they have within them to keep on fighting and to try and vindicate, even 40 years on, and to remember the identity of their loved ones and to vindicate their rights and to get the world to hear the truth about what really happened here during the conflict. Because at the moment, the dominant narrative is so skewed and so wrong that it is really an outrage.
And again, I obviously would commend the book. The book is a read. I think that even though certainly most of us who would come from a nationalist Republican background will not be surprised that the collusion took place. We know, we live with it. But the book chronologically dictates the almost ABCs of what became mass murder. And
the only value in the book is the evidence.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no point writing. It was no point writing. But one of the reasons I didn't want to write the book was I thought that whatever credibility I might still have as a journalist, whatever that was, would have been absolutely blasted to pieces if I'd written a book that there wasn't sufficient evidence in. But the strength of the book is the evidence, the absolute incontrovertible evidence from files and archives. And in 7 years since the book has been published, nobody has been able to challenge one single bit of that evidence.
I want to commend the book. So I just want to move you on just slightly, but the book should be got, it should be read, and also I would suggest that people have an opportunity of going to see the film, Unquiet Grave. They should go to see the film. The film's right.
You can get it online now through Journeyman Pictures and through Amazon Prime as well. So it's not hard to find, and I think, you know, it's a lot of people see the film and then want to read the book because, you know, you can only get so much across in a documentary, an hour and a half long documentary, and you can only get so. I mean, I had to drop 30,000 words out of the first manuscript of the book, which broke my heart. But anyhow, you know, we only had 140,000 words or whatever to write. But the value of the book is in the evidence, and that evidence was gathered way before I joined the PFC by my colleagues, chief amongst them being Alan Brecknell, Paul O'Connor, and others. It was their work and their determination, their dogged stubbornness in sticking with the story and persuading various people to open the files and give them some idea of what was in there. But what breaks my heart really is thinking of all those other families out there who haven't, for whom the truth is there. The truth is in those files. Well, not all the truth, but a lot of detail that families would really need to see is in those files, and we can't get in there because there is not the mechanisms at the moment to allow us to get into those files to show the families the truth about what happened at the time of their loved ones' deaths. And that's why the Stormont House Agreement is so important.
Well, let's move on. We have 5 minutes left. This hour has went by very quickly. So I know in conversation you told me, and you may or may not want to cover it today, that you were working on a new book. Is that top secret, or can we?
Well, before I joined the PFC, one of the reasons that I was so horrified when they asked me to write Lethal Allies was that I had been working on a book for a while, and it's fiction, and I don't even know if I haven't finished it. I've done a lot of work, but I haven't finished it. And if when I finish it, I don't think it's any good, then no one else but me will ever see it. So you may or may not, this book may or may not emerge. And I haven't, I find it very difficult to work and write a work of fiction at the same time. And I also have, my husband is very ill, and that takes a lot of my energy and thoughts. And although he's in a nursing home now, I go and see him every day. And what with that and work and keeping the house going and everything, I don't have that much time. But every now and again, I get a week off and I go up to Donegal and I write. And when I'm up there and I haven't got any distractions, then I write very fast. I don't muck about. And so we'll have to wait and see about that, Joe. We'll have to
I suspect that you'll be back on the program talking about this new bestseller.
That'd be great, wouldn't it?
Tell me, in the last 5 minutes, the Pat Finucane Centre, one of those stalwarts of human rights groups that have been active in exposing injustice and have really battled against all of the odds, lack of finance, lack of resources, all of that. Are there big projects that we should be aware of? And I like to say this, human rights isn't just your responsibility, and legacy isn't just your responsibility, it's all our responsibilities. But within work, where are we now?
Well, of course, the virus has knocked us all sideways. There's an awful lot of work that the PFC does behind the scenes that never reaches, because our priority is working with families, and some of the families we work with don't want publicity, and it's generally thought that we only work with families from one community. In fact, we do work from families from both communities, but as you can understand, a lot of the work is never made public. We're focused a lot on what we can find out at the moment from the British National Archives at Kew, what we can get from there about, and try and find out in London's own words what it was thinking about during the conflict, what its priorities were, particularly in relation to my colleague Margaret Owen of Justice for the Forgotten in Dublin. She's producing another book on Fermanagh, which is coming out very shortly. But in her book, A State in Denial, she focuses in on what was really going on behind the scenes in terms of London's collaboration with Loyalism behind the scenes. Really, what we're we're seekers after truth is what we are, but it's very, very hard to find the truth when there's a huge, massive brick wall between you and the paperwork and documents that would tell you a lot more about the truth. We do believe that reconciliation in the Irish context will be impossible if there isn't an honest re-examination of our shared past. Probably there will never be an agreed narrative, but unless we honestly examine the past, we don't think that there will be the potential for reconciliation and moving forward together. We think it's an absolutely essential part of that work. And at the moment, on the 18th of March, right at the height of the pandemic, let's hope it was the height of pandemic and the height is not yet in front of us, the British government announced that it was going to try and ditch the Stormont House Agreement and the legacy proposals that were hard won and that we had spent an awful lot of time working on. And London is now proposing that there will be an amnesty in effect for soldiers and nothing else will happen. And all those other, if you look at Spain now, the lessons are very obvious, is if you don't examine the past, and at the moment there are mass graves being dug up in Spain. Franco has been moved out of the Valle de los Caídos and buried somewhere else. I mean, Spain is a country which is riven by divisions because they had this omerta at the end of the Civil War and decided not to look into the past, not to examine the past. And it has now come back to bite them. And I think that we will be in the same process in 40 years' time now here in Ireland if we don't honestly and respectfully and sensitively examine our shared past during the conflict, what really happened during the conflict, what was the role of the British government during the conflict in particular, and that we won't be able to move forward. And that is a key part of the PFC's work. But on top of that would be a looking at it collectively. We also, of course, work with individual families and try and find out as much for them as we possibly can. And we work in the archives, in the London archives, and we work with individual families, and we collaborate with other human rights groups such as the Committee on the Administration of Justice and Relatives for Justice to try and engineer it so that the powers that be can't run away from the truth, and that we all, in a respectful and sensitive way, do investigate our shared past. That would be our main project.
Do you ever look back? This is the final question. We'll be glad to hear. But do you ever look back and say, wish I had stayed with the BBC? I wish I had stayed with RTE. Or are you where you are and happy with it?
I'm not happy with where I am, I have to say, but no, I would have, I probably would have been, there was all sorts of pluses and minuses, but if I'd stayed with the BBC or RTE, I would have a much more, I wouldn't have been pushed as far as, I don't think I would have been pushed to the edge of sanity, as I said. But I've had amazing experiences, and I've faced up to desperate challenges, and the rewards of those challenges have been that I've had the friendship of people I would never have possibly met otherwise, and I've become a very different person, and I like the person I've become, and I don't think the person I would have been if I'd stayed in mainstream journalism would have been the same person that I am now. And the rewards have been in my own sense of that I have followed the path that I found in front of me, and that I've been honest, and I've faced up to challenges, and I haven't run away. That's the best I can say.
On those words, Anne, I want to thank you for being my guest this evening. It's been a fascinating interview. I am sure we will return to talk about the book. So from me, Joe Austin, and from Scéalta, thank you.